Good Monday morning. Mondays with Mark. We're back on track. I'm out here at Green Bay Botanical Garden enjoying this beautiful day and taking a look at some plants that are invasive species. I have this really handy little field guide here that's pretty cool, and I believe it is a DNR publication. So if you want to check it out on the DNR and get a copy of it, it's a really cool little thing. It talks about invasive plants, the definition of what they are, and then it has a great identification of it, like the leaf, flower, seed, bark of a tree, and then it talks about why it's bad or an invasive and how to control it. So it's actually a pretty cool little hand guide here that you could easily flip in your back pocket to use. So since it is the season when you see a lot of flowers and some of these invasive species start to stand out a lot more, I'll go over some of the common ones real quick, but I want to show you some other ones and also give you some alternatives to what you can plant when you get rid of those invasives, because that's kind of sometimes a hard thing to think about, because sometimes you don't want to get rid of them because they're like a screen with your neighbor's yard or something like that. So a couple common shrub invasives. This one's really pretty easy to identify now. It's a invasive exotic honeysuckle. There's a couple different species and they kind of cross over a little bit, but you can see this fruit is really pretty distinctive. And as a kid, I remember collecting this and doing random stuff with it, jamming it together into a pie. Luckily, never ate it. The bark is also pretty distinctive once you can tell, and on the bigger trunk sections of it, it's a little more exfoliated, like peeling. And then it has this hollow pith. So that's a really distinctive part of it. So it gets to be pretty easy to identify. And you can see, because of all these fruits, birds will eat it, and then they'll do their duty in the woods. They don't go to the Hobbit House bathroom and spread it throughout, our grounds, but also it can spread from other people's yards into yours too, even if you are controlling it. And then common buckthorn, I got a little piece of that here because that's all over the place. It kind of is a bit sharp. That's why they call it buckthorn, even though it's not, completely thornified. Thornified, is that a word? I'm not sure. But it has these veins of the leaves which go out toward the edge of the leaf. Glossy buckthorn, the veins are at a 45-degree angle. Other interesting identification is they call this sub-opposite. So usually a plant has alternate branching structure or opposite where it's across, but this is sub-opposite where it's not quite opposite, So that's another way to identify it. And this field guide is great if you don't know how to do it. So the other quick one I wanted to talk is it's more of one you don't see as much, but this is an amber maple seedling, so Acer tatericum. It's a common plant that we sometimes will grow as an ornamental, but it actually is something you shouldn't plant because it can spread out and seed out into the woods. And burning bush, we've seen that spread out in the woods at Green Bay Botanical Garden, as well as Japanese barberries. So those are things that are commonly used as a landscape plant. The Tatarian maple, the barberry, and the burning bush, which some of them are restricted now for sale in the state of Wisconsin. So if you have them, if you want to get rid of them, what can you plant instead? Well, a lot of these guys like to go into edges of woods. So we're here at the edge of the Wisconsin Woodland Garden at Green Bay Botanical Garden, across from the cottage garden and adjacent to the Loose House. And you can get some really good ideas of some native plants to plant instead of these invasives. So a couple of things we have right here in the woods that we can just check out. It's actually a garden, not a woods, I guess. But this shrub here that's growing nicely on the edge of the woods is common ninebark. So you're probably familiar with Diablo ninebark or summer wine or some of the purple leaf cultivars, but this is the straight species that's native to the state of Wisconsin. And the great thing about it, it doesn't have the purple leaves, but actually they found in a study that insects prefer the green leaves, and in fact the one thing that they didn't like was purple leaves because they're high in anthocyanins, which is toxic to the insects, so they don't eat them. So you actually want to have green leaves on your ninebark for habitat value, at least, maybe not ornamental value, but habitat value. We also have an American plum over here, Prunus americana. You can see the plums on it. So that's pretty cool. Not only is it a great native plant, but it has fruit that we as humans and other animals can eat. And then Pagoda Dogwood, that's another plant that can grow in the shade. I just actually took a piece of it off because it was not in this particular area, but it is throughout the Wisconsin Woodland Garden here. So it has a horizontal branching structure, really beautiful, some nice kind of purplish fall color, purple maroon. I also have a piece of a witch hazel, just a leaf here, but that is another shrub that grows in part shade to shade. So it can be a plant that can be an alternative to some of these guys that grow in those same conditions. It has flowers in the fall. kind of spidery yellow flowers in the fall. So that's an interesting characteristic of it. And then if we step back here, we also have an American Ironwood here, Australia virginiana. It has these cool, they call it a hop hornbeam sometimes too. I think that's one of the common names at least. I always get that mixed up with the musclewood, which is another plant that can grow, Carpinus caroliniana, that can grow in the shade too. And there's some selections from Johnson's nursery of it that have better fall color. And I always think of that as like Clay Matthews' favorite tree for some reason. I don't know, it's musclewood. It's got really cool bark. It's smooth, muscly. All right, oh, here's our Pagoda Dogwood. I didn't see this guy over here before. But unfortunately, we have one of our dastardly buckthorns here in the edge of our Wisconsin woodland garden that we'll have to cut out. And a lot of times what we do is we cut them with a saw and then we daub the cut stump with herbicide. And it's the best time to do that is actually in the fall when it's translocating energy down to the root system, because then it'll kill the roots too. Also, when you cut that, you like to cut it about 8 inches above the ground, because if it does come back, it'll put out new shoots. And if you cut it right to the ground, sometimes it can have like 8 branches come out, and then all of a sudden now you need to cut 8 times instead of 1 time below where you cut it the first time. So just a little tip and trick there. All right, we're gonna mosey over and look at some more beautiful invasive plants and alternatives. I don't have an alternative for this one, but I just want to point out crown vetch here, which we're starting to see all over the place. And if you have this guy spreading out, usually it's on slopes and things like that. They plant it for erosion control. And it's not prohibited or restricted in the state because it's kind of so far gone to do anything about it. But one thing I did learn from one of our consultants is to cut it now before these seeds are mature, and it would set the seed and they would fall out. You know, some of these might be a little too far gone, but a couple weeks ago we actually cut it all to the ground. So that's another way to treat some of these invasives if you don't want to use herbicide, is just to keep like cutting them and having them grow themselves to death in essence. But you have to keep doing more work then. Another invasive plant that it's a little hard to see because I cut it or planted it, or I didn't plant it, but I cut it for our little segment here, is a tansy. So these are some invasives that you might not know are invasive. So if you see this, best to dig it out, try to remove it, keep getting rid of it so it doesn't come back. But it really has a pretty good alternative that looks a lot like it, is the yarrow. This is moonshine yarrow here. This guy has a little bit of a grayer leaf than the green here. But you can see the flower will look pretty much like it. It's a little bit smaller, but you know, it's a very good substitute for it. Interesting thing, when Chip and I were at the Menominee Nation, we learned that the common yarrow, the native one, the Menominee name for it is squirrel tail. So the leaf kind of does look like a little squirrel tail. So we're like, wow, that's a pretty awesome idea. Another invasive herbaceous perennial you're starting to see in bloom around here in this area is creeping bellflower. So I mean, it's a beautiful plant, right? Kind of. I mean, it's pretty much an escaped garden plant. So oftentimes I've seen it like at boat landings and things where it likes kind of the moister growing conditions. So if you see it, try to pull it out and keep going. It can be hard to get rid of it. You can see every little piece of root and things I can't get, it's going to come back from. So I did my best to get this out of there.
So Mark, for that bellflower, is it, you can tell the difference because it's such a small flower compared to what we're used to seeing in a bellflower?
Yep. If you come over here, Rachel, you'll see, actually, I was going to say this could be a substitute possibly. That's one that we have here. But you can see like a lot of the bellflowers are aggressive and spread, even the ones that are garden plants that aren't restricted in the state right now. But yeah, it has a smaller bellflower, it's taller, and it spreads pretty rapidly too. So I mean, it's over a lot of spots. My mom has some in her garden and she really likes the combination with the bee balm, but it is an aggressive invasive species technically. The other thing I was going to say, another substitute for that could be balloon flower. You know, that has a very similar color to the creeping bellflower we saw in the purplish bluish family. So that's kind of a good substitute too if you are able to keep ripping that out there. Another invasive that's in bloom, getting close to bloom, this is the purple loosestrife I cut off. That's part of our project with the Oneida Nation where we're raising the beetles that you probably saw on Facebook. But this will be starting to bloom And it likes wet conditions, so when you're thinking of what else to plant, think of something that can take those same cultural conditions of exposure, soil, etc. So a lot of times they'll say liatris is a good alternative to it, but that's really only if they're in similar conditions, because this guy likes more dry, typical garden soil, whereas the purple loosestrife is usually in a wetter area, and it's not been for sale for a while, so you really only see it kind of in disturbed areas. But since we have a piece of it, if you do want a similar flower color like that, we also have Stacky's Humolo here, which is more of a smaller growing perennial in our grand garden. I took a piece of this out, but it looks very similar as a substitute for liatris.
Mark, can you talk more about our partnership with Oneida Nation regarding the purple loosestrife?
Yeah, we have a permit for the DNR to actually have dug some of these guys out from the Oneida Nation, and we're growing them in our big high tunnel, which is the repurposed butterfly house. We have 50-ish plants growing out there, and the DNR collected larvae from these beetles that feed on the loosestrife, on the leaves. I believe some of them feed on like the crown and roots. So the idea is to increase the biologicals, so the population of those little beetles. We only put 5 on each of the 50 plants, but hopefully we can raise them up to be about 500 per plant. And then later in the summer, maybe in a couple weeks, once those beetles have been raised, I guess, we're going to put those plants back onto the property of the Oneida Nation with Mike and their crew, and then they're trying to get established biological control of the purple loosestrife, out on their property. Because this can be all over the place. If you start to see it on highways, you'll see the scale of the problem. So it's just impractical to be able to dig it or control it or put herbicide on it. So the idea is to release these beetles there. So it's one of the few biological controls that's been approved for invasive species control. So it's kind of interesting in that way.
And the DNR doesn't have any worries about the beetle becoming invasive?
Nope. They've tested all that out. So that's why it's one of the few that has actually been tested to have the biological control, but you don't see a lot of them like that, because that is a concern, right, that you would release something that could then become a problem to other similar native plants or all plants, or be a problem and make the problem even worse than it is. So that's why we're doing it with them, and through the DNR, of course, so they're in charge of everything. Another substitute for the purple loosestrife that actually makes sense with the conditions of how it grows in the wetland would be swamp milkweed. So this guy I took a while ago, you can see how wilted it is, but that was one that really grows in the same conditions, whereas the liatris here, wouldn't be, even though it's similar look of a flower, this guy would be more likely to survive in a wetland environment. And then the other plant that I was going to quick tell you about is just our common native Monarda fistulosa. That could be a substitute for the creeping bellflower too, or this guy, but I thought of the creeping bellflower because actually when I was pulling this from the edge of the woods, this was growing right next to it. So that's another clue to look of what you could substitute for it if you see a native plant that's right by the one that you're pulling out. That would give you a good clue to what you could use as a substitute maybe. All right, I forgot about our grass thing. Should we go look at that quick?
Yes.
And then we just have one last thing to share with you. As we mosey here, but the cottage actually had a lot of really good substitutes for some of the invasive species, so that was kind of an interesting combination of invasives. Plus, you can come out here to visit the cottage garden because it's in its full glory. Oh, and Lindsay is here. You know her from Fox 11. Yeah, so we covered some shrubs. We covered some perennials. Now, you're probably familiar with Phragmites, this giant grass that's pretty aggressive and takes over a lot of spots. It can be something, some people have it in their yard, not a ton, but it's more of a thing around wetland areas and things. But it is an aggressive invasive species that we need to control and support the control of. But another one is reed canary grass that's a bit smaller. We have a patch of it over here on the edge of this fence line actually, and there is some by our stormwater ponds and things like that. Some of these guys here, can roll in through stormwater and that spreads them, so that's why it's good to control them, because they'll just keep spreading and spreading. But the other thing I was going to tell you is sometimes these invasive species grasses will be in other good grasses, so it can be hard to get them out. So what we do is we just keep pulling them out. But one little tip is that oftentimes these invasive ones will grow faster and more aggressively especially than our warm season prairie grasses that we have planted here. So if you see something growing big and tall and above it and flowering earlier, that's a sign that you might have a weed or an invasive species grass amongst your good grass. Of course, you can look at the texture and the leaf color and all those things too. But if it's growing above and beyond it fast, that's probably a sign that you better take a look-see, because you might have something that you don't want in there. So anyway, those are just some of my random Mondays with Mark tips. But check out this field guide, check out the Department of Natural Resources website. They have some really great information on there. NR 40 is the Wisconsin Administrative Code that regulates invasive species in the state of Wisconsin, so that's a good thing to take a look at, you know, to get an idea of what really is regulated and to really learn about the categories of restricted and prohibited plants in the state. So I encourage you to check that out, to learn more about these and to do your part to help clean them up out of our landscape so that we can have a healthier planet. So for more information, check out our website, gbbg.org, and our Facebook. And have a great day.